Operation Barbarossa was a stunning success. The Nazis invaded the Soviet Union and took the Red Army completely by surprise. Within weeks, they killed or captured millions of its troops. The Wehrmacht managed to seize an area containing 40% of the country's population, as well as most of its coal, iron, and weapons industry. However, it soon became Hitler's greatest failure. Stalin's men managed to hold out until they found the right moment to strike back. Germany lost a huge number of its soldiers, and the Soviets began to march towards their revenge. The beginning of the end of the Third Reich was set in motion. However, the Führer had only been a few miles away from capturing Moscow when that conquest slipped from his grasp. Had he succeeded, it would have meant the fall of the enemy's capital and command center. This leads us to ask, could that conquest have turned the tide of the war? In this new military history video, we're going to explore the possibilities the Nazis had to take control of the city, Stalin's plans if that happened, and how the war would have progressed if Hitler became the lord and master of Moscow.
Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Its target, Stalin's Soviet Union.
Despite the non-aggression pact between the Germans and the Soviets, on June 22, 1941, at the height of World War II, the Nazis launched the most important invasion in their plan to conquer all of Europe. At 3:15 that day, a massive coordinated attack began along a front of more than 1,800 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Operation Barbarossa was underway. The Wehrmacht, the armed forces of the Third Reich, supported by their allies from Finland, Romania, Hungary, and Italy, used their blitzkrieg tactics that had given them great results throughout the Western Front. And that was combined with offensives by their air force, the Luftwaffe, and a large number of tanks that advanced rapidly to surround the Soviet troops. The surprise was total. Stalin had received intelligence reports warning of a possible invasion, but he never imagined that the German initiative was so imminent. As a result, the country's defenses were poorly prepared, and the Nazi army managed to penetrate several kilometers in a matter of weeks. The Luftwaffe was dominant in the first stage, destroying most of the Soviet aviation on the ground and gaining air superiority. The Red Army suffered catastrophic defeats during the initial months. Lack of preparation, chaos in the chain of command, and the shock of the surprise attack were key factors. The troops of the Soviet Union were poorly equipped and dispersed, which allowed the Germans to surround the soldiers and capture large amounts of men and material. In the first 30 days alone, the Nazis detained around 500,000 Soviets who were turned into prisoners. The lack of a coordinated strategy in the Red Army and the internal terror generated by Stalin's reorganization in the previous years contributed to the collapse of the resistance.
3.8 million Axis soldiers would invade and fight in the 5-month operation to destroy the USSR. The Red Army, caught off guard by the timing of the German assault, its officer corps fatally weakened by political purges, reeled under the attacks. The German armies concentrated on 3 main objectives: Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev.
The Wehrmacht made successful massive advances, encircling and destroying large Red Army formations. German victories included battles in which entire cities were surrounded until all rivals within were eliminated, such as those at Bialystok, Minsk, and Smolensk. Hundreds of thousands more Soviet soldiers were captured there. As these numbers grew, Nazi triumph seemed to be just around the corner. At this point, the Nazi troops were divided into 3 large companies so that each could focus on one objective. Army Group North was tasked with heading for Leningrad. Army Group South advanced into Ukraine, with its sights set on Kiev, and Army Group Center went after Moscow. The latter was the most significant, as this conquest would allow Hitler to wrest his seat of power from Stalin. The initial losses of entire cities and more than 1 million soldiers had dealt a severe blow to the Soviet Union, but gradually its forces began to organize a more effective resistance. The orders from their leader were clear: not one step back. This meant that the fighters had to stay fighting until the end, or face execution by their own government. As the Germans advanced, the Soviets applied the scorched earth strategy, which involved destroying installations, burning crops, and evacuating factories to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. If there was one thing Stalin was sure of, it was that if Hitler took his land, he would only be left with the remnants of it. This created the first difficulties in the Nazi strategy. Even as the Führer's forces continued to advance, they began to face logistical challenges. The lack of infrastructure in the vast Soviet expanses made it necessary to implement long supply lines. This caused a wear and tear on Germany's troops, affecting the pace of conquest. Nevertheless, between July and August 1941, Army Group South had significant success in Ukraine. The Führer's men succeeded in encircling and destroying large Soviet formations in Kiev, where one of the Wehrmacht's greatest victories took place, with some 665,000 enemy soldiers captured and taken prisoner. Nothing could stop the German advance. In the north, Nazi forces moved towards Leningrad and began to surround it, beginning the long siege that would last 900 days. Although the city did not fall, it suffered massive devastation and a German blockade that caused famine and huge civilian casualties. Eventually, Army Group Center had redirected part of its forces south to support the battle for Kiev, but in September it fully resumed its main offensive towards Moscow. However, even as the Germans reached the gates of the capital where a depleted Red Army lay in wait, they encountered an unexpected problem.
On the 13th of October, the 3rd Panzer Group was only 87 miles from Moscow, but the weather was bad, with heavy rain and snow that turned the roads into mud. German tanks, with their narrow tracks, struggled to cope. On the 31st of October, a temporary halt to the advance was called, so that the Germans could reorganize their precarious supply situation.
At that time, Stalin had about 90,000 men and 150 tanks to defend Moscow, so the hostile Russian winter was his salvation. Unlike other years, this time the population welcomed his arrival. This gave the Red Army time to reorganize and launch a counterattack that would destabilize the hitherto successful German operation. Several factors began to play in the equation of World War II. The Nazis had to maintain control within the territories won on the Western Front, such as France. In addition, if they wanted to achieve their objective in the Soviet Union, it was necessary to resist the counteroffensive without suffering major setbacks to their forces. And as if this were not enough, on December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, which caused Washington to enter the conflict. Tokyo was one of Germany's allies, but Hitler knew that starting a battle against the American giant could further complicate his situation.
The case against taking on America is obvious.
America was an economic power, a kind of sleeping giant, and he knew that it had massive economic resources that, if turned into military resources, could ultimately affect his ability to win the Second World War.
This turbulent moment with several open fronts can be identified as one of the great turning points in the conflict, marking the beginning of the collapse of the Third Reich. However, it is time for history to take another course. And for that, we must consider what would have happened if the Germans had managed to reach Moscow. Let us imagine for a moment that the harsh winter that saved the Soviet capital was delayed. A more benevolent climate would have accompanied the advance of Hitler's forces, and the fall of the city would have been imminent. A fight was about to begin, but first we must pay attention to the preparations that were being made in case this happened. The Nazis were clear about their movements and had a military advantage. larger and better forces than their rival. Soon the enormous and fearsome figure of the Führer would cross the gates of the capital, and it would be time to flee to save oneself or die in the attempt to confront him. Stalin could only concentrate on a contingency plan in case Moscow was captured. The first thing the Soviet leader had considered was the evacuation, mainly of the entire government structure. The place chosen for the transfer had been the city of Kuibyshev, located 800 kilometers east of Moscow, on the banks of the Volga River. Designated as the reserve capital when the German forces came dangerously close, it would begin to receive part of the foreign diplomatic corps operating in the Kremlin, all under the deepest secrecy.
15 октября 1941 Государственный комитет обороны издал совершенно секретное постановление об эвакуации столицы СССР города Москвы в город Куйбышев. Будь оно хоть трижды секретным, утаить масштабную эвакуацию правительственных учреждений, государственных и партийных организаций было невозможно. Руководители среднего и низшего звена бежали из города вместе с семьями, вывозя личное и казенное имущество.
Beyond political command, the plan also included the transfer of military industry as a key measure. With the Nazis crossing the gates of Moscow, Stalin had already evacuated factories to the east of the country. He would not anchor the most important elements of the Soviet structure in one place, so companies would be set up in different destinations, such as the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Around 1,500 companies would be dismantled and relocated, with personnel, machinery, and raw materials. The chosen locations had to be as far away from the German advance as possible, so that they could not be reached by their attacks. These industries would be essential to maintain the production of tanks, airplanes, ammunition, and other war equipment that would sustain the Soviet war effort. Even if the capital fell, the ability to manufacture new weapons for the Red Army's combat would not be affected. It was the best option if the Soviet Union wanted to maintain a long-term defense. Stalin was clear that the capture of Moscow did not mean the end of the war. For this reason, plans had been drawn up to continue resistance from other areas of the country's vast territory. Once in the east, Soviet troops could reorganize around the Ural line and defend both the new capital Kuibyshev and other important cities.
Тупик, ни на аэродром. Что же делать, если немцы все-таки возьмут столицу? В таком случае Ставка Верховного Главнокомандования планировала создать новый стратегический рубеж обороны. На этом укрепленном рубеже запланировали расположить 10 новых резервных армий. Из-за него же, в случае поражения под Москвой и на Украине, должны были отходить остатки прочих советских войск. Южная часть этого рубежа, проходившая по Волге, совпадала с линией, которой по плану Барбаросса должны были в итоге достичь германские войска.
In this way, a surrender or the fall of Moscow would have been seen as just another battle in a protracted war. Stalin and his government would continue to oversee and coordinate military operations from Kuibyshev, or even a new city if necessary. The most important thing would be to be able to maintain the capacity of the Red Army and the morale of the people. The latter was not an alien factor to the Soviet leader's thinking. He understood that the capture of the Russian capital would be a serious psychological blow, both to the people and to the credibility of the communist regime. However, he would do everything possible to turn the fall of Moscow into a symbol of struggle and resistance. Instead of surrendering, Stalin would use propaganda to present a great patriotic war, urging citizens to continue fighting against the Nazi invader, despite the temporary loss of their main city. And to set an example, he decided to alter the part of the plan in which he himself was evacuated from the Kremlin to settle in a new location. With the aim of keeping the morale of his men high, he became the emblem of resistance.
Он понял, что после его отъезда управление и сопротивление в Москве окончательно развалятся, и столица неминуемо падет. Поэтому и пошел на риск, оставшись в Кремле вместе с несколькими членами Политбюро и малой группой сотрудников оперативного управления Генштаба.
Staying on the looming battlefield against the Nazis reinforced Stalin's image as a decisive leader, highlighting his determination not to leave the capital without a fight. he called for popular resistance with the aim of creating a huge guerrilla force. Despite having no preparation or training, he would turn the occupation of Moscow into a gigantic logistical and military challenge for the Germans. In this way, Stalin's elaborate plan was in motion, and all that was left was to wait. Thousands of civilians would dig trenches, build barricades, and prepare desperate defenses on the outskirts of the city. Anti-tank guns, barbed wire, bunkers, mines, and all kinds of improvised equipment would be prepared to fortify the capital. The moment arrives. The Nazi army arrives with unstoppable power, and we are going to immerse ourselves in the heart of this battle. Quickly, the streets become the scene of an urban war with house-to-house fighting. Soviet soldiers, supported by the civilian population, turn every building into a stronghold, but it is impossible to resist the overwhelming German advance. Even so, the citizens use every small advantage to their advantage to inflict damage. Avenues and squares become a challenging environment for German tanks, which are left exposed and in the sights of local artillery. Soviet snipers also use the architecture of the capital to ambush the invading troops. The battle is brutal, and blood is spilled in every corner. As the fighting takes place in the middle of buildings, the fighting not only becomes more savage, but the German advantage in armor and artillery is neutralized. The huge vehicles cannot access the areas of greatest concentration of fighting, leaving them obsolete for the fight. Likewise, Hitler's men are better prepared for battle than the Soviet soldiers and civilians who make up the resistance. This is slowly becoming evident. Moscow is falling. Stalin desperately uses the regime's propaganda to urge Muscovites to defend the city at all costs. Popular resistance has been fierce, similar to that seen in Leningrad and Stalingrad. However, it is beginning to weaken. The urban militias no longer distinguish their members. They are made up of any brave person who dares to fight in the streets. Factory workers, old people, women, and teenagers. The sense of patriotism is the only thing that still keeps the city standing. The Kremlin building is the last bunker and symbol of Soviet power. It has become the main target of the German army. Some of the most intense and bloody battles take place around this fortress, but everything is about to end. The Germans take over the building and plant their flag on top. Stalin understands that the capital is already lost and flees to the new city that will serve as the country's administrative center. Hitler and his Third Reich celebrate a key victory, but the Soviet Union does not despair. A message in the media evokes the words of a former Russian soldier known for his battles against Napoleon and seeks to bring calm to his people.
Официальная пропаганда не раз цитировала изречение Кутузова: «С потерей Москвы не потеряна Россия». Народ слушал и понимал, это неспроста.
It is true that the Germans have just achieved a victory with great symbolic weight, but winning a battle and triumphing in a war are two very different things. The Nazi army has achieved the success it went to the Soviet capital for, but is now suffering the consequences. The prolonged fighting in the cold winter and the fierce resistance have considerably weakened its forces. Those soldiers who are still alive will hardly have the energy to continue advancing with a new battle in the short term. Moreover, due to the Soviet Union's scorched earth policy, German supply lines are already too long to continue sustaining an offensive towards other regions of the country. Meanwhile, the Red Army is taking advantage of these problems. It begins to rise from the ashes, and in the brand new capital, it prepares new battalions of brutal soldiers, and with uninterrupted weapons production, it launches a counter-offensive with airstrikes on rival positions. This means that the enormous effort of the Führer's troops has only managed to wear down his men, both morally and physically, without offering a decisive victory. The Eastern Front remains immense, and the capture of Moscow does not mean the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union. The fighters under Stalin's command are preparing to continue fighting from other regions further east, which will probably prolong the war for much longer. Moscow has fallen into Hitler's hands, but the Nazi leader in turn fell into a deadly trap. Weakened for future campaigns in the enormous Soviet Union, he must also deal with the front in the West, where a powerful contender like the United States has joined the war. Approaching the end, we can say, almost with total certainty, that a German victory in the Russian capital would have brought more problems than solutions for the Third Reich. The great wear and tear that it would have meant would not have provided any significant value. The Red Army would still exist, and there would still be a huge territory ahead to conquer the Soviet Union. In addition, the offensive from France would soon arrive, which would complete the German debacle and the brutal fall of Adolf Hitler. Now, after having built this alternative history and knowing its outcome, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us. We look forward to seeing you again in our next video.